This screencast will give you an introduction to jQuery. We'll explain what jQuery is, why you'd use it, and then how you'd use it in your code. After finishing this screencast, you'll be able to use the core functionality of jQuery in your projects and be on your way to writing unobtrusive JavaScript in powerful web applications. To fully appreciate jQuery, let's quickly review some web development history. Back in the early days of the web, people used tables and inline styling, such as the font tag, to build websites. This made it difficult for search engines and screen readers to navigate the HTML markup. More recently, CSS evangelists started telling us we should have a separation between markup and layout. This enables web developers and designers to build the same web page with separate styling and cleaner markup. This has a number of benefits. It improves the experience for screen readers and search engines, but it also reduces load time with smaller HTML files and styling in only one file. This also makes websites more manageable. As broadband speeds became more common, websites could become more complex using languages like JavaScript to deliver more desktop-like experiences on the web. Originally, JavaScript would be included directly in the HTML markup. This started cluttering the HTML, a problem almost identical to the pre-CSS inline styling era. The inclusion of inline JavaScript broke screen readers, hindered readability by search engine spiders, and often broke in other browsers. As before, leaders of the web developer community advocated better ways of including JavaScript into web applications. This separation of behavior from the HTML markup is called unobtrusive JavaScript. Just as the CSS evangelists told us there should be a separation of layout from markup, JavaScript evangelists told us there should be a separation of behavior from markup. Let's say you want to open a pop-up in a new window when clicking a link. There are several ways you can go about this. One way would be to put a hash in the href attribute and move the JavaScript code into the onClick attribute. Here is the code working correctly in a browser with JavaScript enabled. But as you can see, if JavaScript is disabled, the user is left stuck on the page. A better way would be to include the pop-up file name in the href attribute, as well as including the JavaScript in the onClick attribute. This way, if the user disables JavaScript, they can still access the pop-up, but in the same window as the previous page. However, if we had several links like this, we would be duplicating a lot of the same JavaScript code. CSS enables us to describe our document's layout by assigning classes to elements. We can use this technique to apply behavior to elements in an efficient manner. The best practice would be to add a descriptive class, such as new window, to our link. In order to apply our desired behavior to the link, we need to implement the behavior in JavaScript. First, we need to apply the functionality when the document loads. Then we need to iterate through the document's anchors, or links, looking for our new window class. The reason we're getting elements by tag name and then checking the class is because some older browsers, such as IE6, don't have the method getElements by class name, so we have to cater to the lowest common denominator. Once we've found the link in question, we need to add the desired functionality. Return false tells the browser not to load the pop-up page in the current window. When JavaScript is switched off, the link will work as a standard link. This is known as graceful degradation. But this code is far from perfect. There are a number of problems. The window onload handler gets executed after the page and any images have loaded. This means your application may not look as desired until the browser has finished loading the assets. This code overrides any existing load or click handlers, which could be in conflict with other behaviors. This could be a problem if you're working on a project with two developers and you're both applying behavior to the same link. If this were the case, the last behavior executed would win. The way we are checking for the classes applied to our links is very brittle. It wouldn't work for links with more than one class applied to it. For example, our code wouldn't work for a link with a class attribute new window external link. The way to overcome these issues is to use jQuery. jQuery uses the same CSS selectors and syntax you're probably already using to style your pages, so you almost already know how to apply behavior to your markup using jQuery. You don't have to worry about cross-browser compatibility since jQuery selectors work in all modern browsers, including IE6. It's also compatible with other JavaScript frameworks, so you can use it alongside things such as DWR and Prototype. The behavior is ready faster than with traditional JavaScript, since jQuery provides an onReady handler which executes when the HTML file is downloaded but the images haven't yet. The onLoad handler, used by traditional JavaScript, executes after the images have downloaded. So jQuery gets your behavior ready in milliseconds, as opposed to seconds. As you'll see, jQuery allows you to write less code and do more. To use jQuery in a project, you first need to visit the jQuery website. As you can see, there are two different versions. One is 24 kilobytes for production, and one is 155 kilobytes for development. Development is an uncompressed version of the jQuery, whereas the production has gone through a compression process known as minification. Minifying a JavaScript file means that all unnecessary whitespace, newline characters, and comments are removed. The minification process can also pass the JavaScript file through an obfuscation process, which reduces the amount of data transferred over the wire by shortening variables and function names. When you download the production version of jQuery, you'll notice that the size of the file is not 24 kilobytes, it's around 70 kilobytes. This is not a mistake. The jQuery minified version is actually not 24 kilobytes, but 70 kilobytes. However, if you go back to jQuery.com, the production version doesn't just say minified, it also says gzipped. Gzipping is a process for compressing plain text files such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript between web server and web browser. When a browser makes a request, it sends a header to say that it accepts gzip compressed content. The web server, such as Apache, if configured correctly, recognizes the request header and serves up the compressed file. The browser in turn decompresses the requested file. This conserves bandwidth and improves load times. So if gzip compression is switched on, the production jQuery is 24 kilobytes over the wire. Most shared hosts have this set up already, so you don't need to worry. If you have your own self-managed dedicated server, you probably need to set it up yourself. But this is beyond the scope of this screencast, so if you need to do that, look at the documentation for your web server. However, there is an alternative to serving up the jQuery library yourself. Google has provided all major JavaScript libraries, including jQuery, on their content distribution network with all the appropriate compression and caching switched on. So you don't need to worry about this. The other advantage of this is that many other sites use Google's Ajax Libraries API to serve jQuery. What this means is that if a user has visited a site already using Google's served up jQuery, it will be cached on their machine, reducing load times on your site. The only reason you wouldn't want to use this is if you're using jQuery in an offline or sensitive environment, such as an internal intranet site, and you don't want to be going out on the web to include JavaScript. Once you've downloaded the version of jQuery you want, or found the URL from Google, all you need to do is include the jQuery file in your HTML somewhere. This can be done in two places. The first place is at the top of the page in the head tag. This means you'll have to use the ready callback to execute jQuery or JavaScript code. First, we are including Google's hosted jQuery. The reason we have two script tags is because we are specifying a source for the first one, which means that the contents of this tag would not get evaluated. To get around this, we include another tag and put our JavaScript in there. When the HTML document has loaded and is ready to be manipulated by jQuery, the anonymous function or handler gets executed and the code is run. You can remove document ready and it will still work. Either way is acceptable. The second way of including jQuery is at the bottom of the page, just before the closing body tag. But this time you don't need to use the ready event because the page is already downloaded and is ready to be manipulated. So now it looks like this. This way is recommended to increase page load speeds, giving your users a better experience. As you can see with both of our examples on how to include jQuery, the paragraph tag gets populated with the text, "Hello jQuery." Now let's move on to the main code example. Here is an example web page with 2 forms and an article. The code for this example is linked in the show notes. In this example, we're going to cover how to hide the forms when the page loads, set up jQuery functions to reveal the appropriate form when a link is pressed, and show some basic validation on the form. You'll learn how to select, manipulate, and transverse your HTML document using jQuery. So let's get to it. Open the index.html file in your browser. As you can see, we have 2 links, sign in and sign up. They link to their respective forms. Now, open the index.html file in your editor of choice. As you can see, we have 2 links in an ordered list, followed by 2 forms, sign in and sign up, and then an article. The forms are very basic with a small number of fields. If you'd like to familiarize yourself with the HTML, feel free to pause the video at this point and review the code. Obviously, showing the 2 forms on the page like this isn't desirable. Let's use jQuery to hide the forms. First, we need to add jQuery to our page, then create an application.js file, and then include that file in our document. In order to identify the form containers in jQuery, we need to select them using CSS. In this case, we could use the div IDs to identify each form container. But in this example, we're going to set up a class to group the containers together and apply the same behavior. This allows us to add more forms in the future without modifying the JavaScript or jQuery and still get the desired effect. So let's add class equals forms to each of the form divs. Because we're including application.js at the end of the file, we don't need to manually add the onReady callback. All we need to do is put in the jQuery behavior we want to be executed as soon as the file is loaded. To hide the forms, we simply add $.forms.hide to our application.js file. As you can see, when we refresh the page in our browser, the forms are now hidden. When we click on these links, however, nothing happens. Now we need to add the behavior to reveal the forms. We need to add a click event listener to the link elements contained within the unordered list and list items. In order to check that we are correctly binding this function to the link elements, let's add a simple alert to verify. In the function, this refers to the DOM element in which the click handler has been triggered. In order to get the jQuery representation of the DOM element, we need to enclose this in parentheses with a $sign in front of it. Now that we have a jQuery representation of the object, we can now use jQuery methods on it. The attr method can be used to access the value of a given attribute, in this case, href. So let's check this out in the browser to see if it's working correctly. Okay, great. Clicking on the link gives us the desired executed code. If you notice, the hash link is also exactly the same as the CSS selector for the relevant forms container. So let's now select that using jQuery and use the jQuery show method in order to reveal it. For the sake of convenience and readability, we will create a local variable called ID2show. Then, we need to get the jQuery representation of the element with that ID by adding the jQuery parentheses around ID2show. We then add .show, and as you can see, it shows the correct form. But if you notice, when we click the other link, it now shows both of the forms. Ideally, we'd want the other forms container to hide. In order to do this, we create a local variable, siblings, and assign it to id2show.siblings. On the next line, we write siblings.hide in order to hide the siblings. If we launch this in the browser now, we'll see that when we click on a button, the entire page is hidden apart from our selected form. This obviously isn't what we want, so let's go back to our .js file and be more specific in the siblings that we want to hide. So within the siblings function, we can pass in the CSS selector we want to hide, in this case, forms. So our earlier decision to create the class forms to identify our form containers has now made this a trivial exercise. If we had just used the IDs of the containers, we would have to implement a much more complex method to hide the form containers. Now that we've added the forms CSS selector to our siblings function, we can see in our browser that the desired functionality of hiding the other form is working. But the browser is jumping to the top of each form container when clicked. To prevent this, all we need to do is add return false to the end of our function, which overrides the default browser behavior for a link. jQuery enables us to chain methods together, so we can write this in fewer lines. At the end of the show method, we can add siblings.forms followed by .hide. What this is doing is getting the siblings of the container we want to show and hiding them. Now, let's add a way to notify the user when the password fields don't match. To do this, we need to add a jQuery event listener to our password confirmation field. We need to watch for keystrokes on the field and compare it with the first password field. The key up event is triggered after a key is pressed. Once again, we need to implement an anonymous function to be triggered on key up. On any type of input, you can call val to retrieve the value of that particular input. So here we need to see if the two passwords match or not. If they don't match, we'll add a CSS class called error to notify the user. It could be named anything, we're just using something sensible. We need to remember to add some styling in our CSS to alert the user. So now when we type test into our password field and test1 in our confirmation, we see the error class being applied. Great, but this isn't quite complete because when we correct the confirmation field, the error class isn't removed. To do this, we just need to include an else statement to remove the error class when it matches. Simple. Here we can see that when the fields match, the error class is being removed correctly. Finally, we want to include a text message to notify the user when the passwords don't match. First, let's add an empty span tag right after our confirmation input in the HTML. In order to get the span from the confirmation field, we can transverse or move through the document by using the next method. This will return the span element for you to manipulate. All we need to do now is add the text method to the return span with the strings we want it to display. So we'll display passwords don't match when they don't match and an empty string when they do match. Again, we're chaining methods together, but this could be written over many lines. But chaining methods like this makes the code much easier to read. Hit refresh, and we have our fully working example. In this jQuery introduction, we've covered several main areas: accessing attributes, manipulating HTML, transversing the document, applying effects, and handling events. Thank you for your time, and we hope you'll have fun putting your new skills to use. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, please email feedback@screencasts.org. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our RSS feed and newsletter to be notified about jQuery and other web development screencasts as they become available. See you next time.